JLA is no fun, I'll tell you that much.
Oh, you been?
Yeah, once. In Monopoly.
So here's the thing. I wasn't expecting to make another video on Marvel's Avengers. I was well and truly done with that game on this channel. Over the course of 3 years, I have made 3 separate videos on Marvel's Avengers covering the birth, life, and death of the game. But because all the cool costumes are free and I actually really enjoy the gameplay, I kept playing. And playing. And playing and playing and playing and playing and god damn it, fine, I'll make another video. And we're bringing back Chimera Creates, because why not? This time, we're covering my ideas for how to make Marvel's Avengers 2, or as fans have come to collectively name it, Marvel's Avengers Reassembled. In this, I want to focus on 3 things: the roster of this new game, the story I want to tell, or rather continue, and the changes to overall gameplay systems that would help the game feel better overall. Hopefully this video doesn't go on for too long.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
So without further ado, let's get into it.
You know what I've realized?
Some thoughts are better left unsaid.
Nice try. Anyways.
Before I address the actual game pitch, I want to add a few disclaimers right here. First, I am not a game designer, nor a professional narrative writer. I have no idea if any of these ideas I have would be doable, let alone good in practice. I do know that I have several hundred hours in this game, pretty extensive knowledge of the game's lore, as well as the lore of these new characters I'm adding, and a craving for Avengers stories that aren't focused on being adaptation of Marvel Comics events, and instead focus on being actual Avengers stories. Second disclaimer, I'm pretty open to criticism on this. If any of the ideas in this video do not work for you for one reason or another, feel free to let me know in the comments. Explain how you would build out these characters, this universe, and how you would improve on the structure of the original game without completely abandoning what a lot of people liked about it. And third disclaimer, all of this is subjective. I am writing the Avengers continuation I want to write. I am picking characters not based on popularity or MCU synergy, but how they fit into the story I am trying to tell. Although like 90% of the characters I'm adding anyways are already in the MCU or going to be, so whatever. Considering this game will probably never exist, everyone's ideas are as good as anyone else's. And a final disclaimer before we talk about characters, you may notice that there's 1 or 2 particular characters missing from my Avengers roster who tend to be very prevalent to the team's comic and movie incarnations. I did not forget any of those characters, I just didn't want to include some of them. But I did find a way. This video will cover the first 3 years of the game, but there is a secret companion video about years 4 and 5, where I pitch 8 more characters, including Doctor Strange, as well as 2 more Avengers stories that have almost nothing to do with what happens in the rest of the campaign. You can find this companion video exclusively on my Patreon, more on that at the end. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about the roster.
I'm going to hell.
Yeah, probably.
I'll pick you up.
Hell yeah. Carpool?
Okay, so I'm not going to do like a full skill tree breakdown for everyone in this game. I'm just going to talk about a handful of things. I will introduce the character by using their lore, which means I'm describing the character's history in this game's universe. Some will be very similar to the comics, some will be very different. For the most part, if you hear something that doesn't line up with the character's lore from the books, do not leave that comment telling me that I'm wrong, because it was likely a deliberate choice to fit the game's universe or this story, or probably both. Long story short, you'll hear me talk about what their background is, what they can do in full, and why they joined the Avengers. I'll also talk about the characters' kits, specifically their ranged attacks, intrinsic ability, and heroic abilities. For those who don't remember or have not played the last game, the intrinsic meter is the meter below a hero's health bar. Holding the right trigger on consoles can activate a few different abilities dependent on that hero's powers. Kamala gets bigger and has increased damage, fuels Tony's weapon systems, etc. Meanwhile, the heroic attacks are activated with bumper presses and are classified as support, assault, and ultimate, although most of these support ones are less team support and more self-boost. Speaking of the last game, the entire Avengers 1 roster returns, those characters being Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Black Widow, Miss Marvel, Kate Bishop, Hawkeye, Black Panther, the Mighty Thor, and the Winter Soldier, as well as Spider-Man exclusively on PlayStation. And then just for fun, I'll throw in 3 costumes that I think the character should have based on previous comic appearances. I'm not including MCU costumes since those feel like a given, and I'm not highlighting anything that feels too much like the default look for that character. For example, this is what Captain Marvel looks like in this universe. It's more or less her current comic costume, so don't expect anything resembling that on my list for her. Okay, just to recap, we'll be looking at each character's lore, their kit, which boils down to their ranged attacks, intrinsic ability, and 3 heroics, and then 3 costumes for each. And I've got 12 heroes. 9 of them tie directly into the plot of my Avengers story for the post-launch, which is separated into 3 arcs: the Ultron Imperative, the Masters of Evil, and the Kree Invasion. In addition, I have 3 heroes that should be featured in the game at launch, and we're going to start with those.
It's not like I try to blow things up exactly. It just sort of happens. You gotta admit though, fire is badass.
Air Force Lieutenant Colonel James Rhodey Rhodes is Tony Stark's best friend. Before Tony became Iron Man, Rhodey was the liaison between the United States military and Stark Industries, quickly becoming friends with Tony. While Tony went through a brief but rough battle with alcohol abuse, Rhodey took over Tony's duties as Iron Man. Tony repaid his friend by gifting him an earlier model of the Iron Man suit, and Rhodey worked with Stark Industries and military engineers to get it more suited for combat. The engineers referred to it as the Variable Threat Response Battlesuit, but Tony always referred to it as the War Machine. Rhodey served as the War Machine until Monica and AIM seized the armor during the buyout of Stark Industries and all of its assets. In between the events of the first game and now, the Avengers found and reclaimed the War Machine from an AIM facility and offered Rhodey a spot on the team. Looking to get back in action and feeling the call of duty, Rhodey accepts the offer. The War Machine armor comes with a lot of bells and whistles in the form of bombs and weapons, and I wanted his kit to reflect that while also mirroring Tony in a few ways. His ranged weapons align with that of Tony's in some regards: repulsors for precision shots at medium rate, submachine guns for steady automatic fire, and concussive rockets at a slow rate that do a lot of stun damage. While the submachine guns run out of firing capacity as they overheat, the repulsors and rockets are powered by Rhodey's intrinsic meter. That meter can also power a counterattack that utilizes the suit's forearm shotguns. His support heroic allows the shoulder-mounted minigun to swivel and fire at enemies War Machine is not currently targeting. His assault heroic is essentially a much shorter version of the Hulkbuster's rocket barrage, and his ultimate sends all of his weapon systems into overdrive. Repulsors no longer need time to charge to their maximum power, the rockets now automatically target enemies in your field of view, and the submachine guns get replaced by the minigun, which can pierce enemy force fields and doesn't overheat. Overall, Rhodey is a hero driven by an overwhelming sense of duty, and his kit revolves around doing damage from afar. For his costumes, I'd like to see he takes on Rhodey's Stain Tech Cyborg era, his first appearance armor that doesn't have a visible arc reactor, and the Iron Patriot look he briefly adopted in both comics and movies.
New year, same me, because I'm perfect.
Jennifer Walters is the cousin of Bruce Banner and a lawyer at a prestigious law firm. Jen and Bruce grew up together, and she served as a legal representative for the Avengers when Bruce joined the team upon its founding. When the Avengers disbanded, Jen struggled to find work elsewhere, but eventually found work at a practice specializing in superhuman law. When the Avengers returned, Jen did not hesitate to start moonlighting as the Avengers' legal representative again, attempting to take down AIM's facade of being a reputable scientific organization by striking at their public image, building cases prosecuting AIM for humanitarian crimes, representing inhuman victims of AIM's experiments and their families, and working to legally reacquire assets AIM claimed from the Avengers following A-Day. And needless to say, Jen is really good at her job, and AIM didn't exactly take kindly to this. They attempted to assassinate Jen by placing a bomb in her car. Fortunately, Jen happened to be with Bruce that night, who rushed Jen to a hospital where they performed an emergency blood transfusion. This transfusion would give Jen the same gamma radiation that Bruce has, allowing her to transform into a Hulk, though one a little bit weaker and more intelligent than her cousin. And then Jen saw an opportunity to fight her war on 2 fronts. Sue AIM into the ground as Jen Walters, and beat them into submission as the sensational She-Hulk. Jen comes with the standard Hulk power set of increased strength, stamina, durability, and healing, but also brandishes 2 wrist-mounted devices known as the Gamma Gauntlets. These help Jen regulate her gamma radiation so she doesn't turn into a full-on Hulk, but also siphons that energy into gamma blasts, which serve as her ranged attack. This is powered by an intrinsic meter, which can also be used to apply gamma damage to all of Jen's melee attacks. Her support channels Jen's rage into increased damage. Her assault heroic sees Jen mimic her cousin by throwing a large chunk of the ground at enemies, which then rolls around before crumbling to pieces. And her ultimate is a stream of repetitive thunderclaps, which can be aimed at enemies, unlike Bruce's AoE thunderclap. Jen joins the Avengers to help people who the law has failed and punish those that the law cannot reach. and her kit reflects Jen's brawler attitude as She-Hulk. For her costume, I'd love to see the classic pink leotard from the 80s, the weird purple and white one that has an S and an H on it, and of course, a nice lawyerly business suit for Jen.
You know the sound a fork makes in the garbage disposal. Yeah, that's the sound my brain makes all the time.
Monica Rambeau is a former US Navy officer who was close friends with former Air Force test pilot Carol Danvers. When Carol first became Miss Marvel, Monica was the first person in Carol's life to find out, and when Carol's Kree adversaries found out about her friend, they kidnapped her and imprisoned her alongside Mar-Vell, who was serving as Captain Marvel at the time. Carol attempted to rescue Monica and Mar-Vell, and in that attempt, Mar-Vell was killed in an explosion that should have killed Monica as well. For reasons nobody can explain, the power within Mar-Vell combined with Monica's physiology as he died, giving her superpowers, specifically the ability to manipulate and alter any form of energy in the electromagnetic spectrum. This allows her to fly, fire photon blasts, become invisible, absorb energy, and plenty of other things. So while Carol joined the Avengers as the new Captain Marvel, Monica did the sensible thing and joined S.H.I.E.L.D., utilizing her powers as an agent under the codename Spectrum. She stayed with the organization until its public fall from grace after A-Day, and eventually joins the Avengers after Carol sends her first message from space in years, alerting her team that she's flying back home and requesting that Monica be granted membership. Monica's kit reflects her powers in a lot of fun ways. First, her ranged attacks allow her to alternate between firing a single photon blast, a wave of energy, and a continuous beam, all drawing from her intrinsic meter. Her intrinsic meter also allows her to create small, stationary force fields, which convert absorbed damage into heroic charge. Her support heroic is a straight-up, good old-fashioned invisibility. Her assault allows her to turn into light and dash between enemies with blistering speed and truck-like impact. And her ultimate allows her to absorb incoming attacks and convert them into a large AoE blast. The more she absorbs, the bigger the blast. Ultimately, Spectrum is a hero defined by her resilience, who joins the Avengers out of respect for her friend, with a kit built around stealth, defense, and ranged combat. For her costumes, I would love to see her look from the Mighty Avengers, her current costume is Photon, and her original costume is Captain Marvel.
If history repeats itself, I am so gonna get a dinosaur.
Scott Lang is a former criminal who currently works as a thief and escape artist for the Resistance. His skills as an electrical engineer and past as a cat burglar who ripped off corrupt corporations caught the attention of Hank Pym, who employs Scott to break into AIM facilities that require a more subtle entrance than the Avengers can provide. Scott steals things that AIM holds precious and breaks out Inhumans that AIM imprisons. But then, while the Avengers are distracted with a new threat, Monica Rappaccini kidnaps Scott's daughter Cassie and forces Scott to make a choice: reveal the location of the Resistance base known as the Ant Hill, or let his daughter die. So Scott takes option C. He steals from his own boss and uses Hank Pym's original Ant-Man suit to attempt to break her out of AIM's prison. The plan goes horribly, but thankfully the Avengers show up to help Scott save Cassie. Scott apologizes profusely for stealing the suit, but Hank recognizes that Scott shows an aptitude for being Ant-Man, and simply asks that Scott repays him by joining the Avengers in their fight against Hank's robot assistant Roy, who has gained malevolent sentience and started going by the name Ultron. So Scott joins the team and becomes an Avenger out of guilt, a desire to help his daughter, and more or less just out of circumstance. I think most of you know Ant-Man's general power set: shrinking, growing, and the ability to communicate with high-level insects, mostly ants. So let's talk about how that applies to his kit. Scott's range attack is a ray gun with two settings: shrinking and growing. If Scott shoots an enemy with the red particles enough, they'll shrink, and that works exactly as it does in the original game. Enemies become tiny and take way more damage and more knockback. The growth effect makes enemies larger and slower, making them easier targets for your team to shoot. Scott's intrinsic allows him to surround the area around him with ants, which will crawl on nearby enemies to stun and damage them over time. His support allows him to shrink down to bug size, making him functionally invisible while also increasing his damage and knockback. His assault heroic sees him pull what seems to be a toy car from his belt, roll it along the floor, and shoot it with a ray gun, making it instantly grow to regular size and demolish anything caught in its path. His ultimate, as you probably guessed, is just turning into Giant Man, which functions more or less the same as Kamala's Embiggen: higher damage and increased knockback, as well as access to new moves. So Scott is a reluctant hero with a kit built around stunning and altering the sizes of his enemies, but he has the means to bash his way out of a crowd if need be. As far as his costumes, I'm really liking the Eric O'Grady suit from the Irredeemable Ant-Man, the classic Hank Pym suit, and the suit Scott wore during his tenure with the Young Avengers.
If I stay in bed, I'll be warm. If I get in the shower, I'll also be warm. But the distance between the bed and shower? No, that is not warm.
Nadia Van Dyne is the daughter of former Avenger Hank Pym and his wife Janet Van Dyne. After Hank left the Avengers before the events of the game, he quit the superhero life to focus on his company and his family. When AIM tortured and kidnapped Hank, they also kidnapped his family. Hank presumed they were killed, which is part of what inspired his revolution that led to the formation of the Resistance. In reality, Janet and Nadia were taken to a separate facility, where Nadia was experimented on. You see, due to her father's use of the Pym particle over the many years of his exploits as Ant-Man, Nadia came out with the particles infused into her DNA, meaning she can alter her size on command without the use of a suit. Nadia's powers are unstable and considerably stronger than that of her father's technology. While Hank could only ever shrink down to half an inch tall, Nadia can shrink down small enough to access the subatomic realm known as the Microverse. Nadia was trained to harness her powers and trained in the art of combat by another one of AIM's unwilling assets, Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier. AIM also created a suit based on Hank and Janet's designs for a suit that she elected to just never use. The suit allows Nadia to fly, communicate with insects, and fire electric blasts from her hands. And under threat of her mother's execution, Nadia becomes an assassin for AIM known as the Wasp. And while Nadia didn't want to do this, she hoped, pun intended, that it would earn her and her mother's freedom. Eventually, Nadia and Janet would be freed by Hank, Scott, and the rest of the Avengers, and Nadia would eagerly offer to join the team. For her kit, let's start with her ranged attack. Nadia can fire her stingers in 3 modes: semi-automatic, burst fire, and full auto. The faster she shoots, the bigger the spread, but also the greater the stun. Her intrinsic allows her to grow ever so slightly for increased damage. Her support summons actual wasps to stun her enemies. Her assault is an area of effect attack where she rapid fires her stingers in a sort of sweeping motion. Her ultimate involves her popping into the microverse and bringing back a rhino-like creature that will just wreck shop, kind of like the brawlers from Prototype 2. Overall, Nadia is a tragic character, but an incredibly eager hero, with a kit built mostly around just doing damage with a mix of her powers and martial arts training. As far as costumes go, I'd love to see a classic costume resembling Janet's look from Earth's Mightiest Heroes, an Ultimate Wasp costume, and Janet's look from the West Coast Avengers days. I know all these are Janet costumes, but Nadia doesn't exactly have much to work with.
Remember, when burying a body, make sure to cover it with endangered plants so it's illegal to dig up. Make sure to follow me for more gardening tips.
Rounding out the Ultron arc, we have the Vision. The Vision is a synthezoid created by Ultron to be a companion/henchman to assist Ultron in achieving his goals. We'll get into what those are when we do the plot breakdown, but the basics of Vision is that he is an android created by Ultron and powered by the Cosmic Cube, which gives him phenomenal powers including flight, density shifting, laser beams, technopathy, and superhuman strength. Vision's body is also composed of nanites, which means he can alter his form and regenerate from injury. Once Vision realizes what Ultron's plan is and gains sentience of his own, he chooses to side with goodness and humanity and join the Avengers. Vision's kit leans hard into how diverse his powers are. His range is pretty simple: a concise laser blast akin to Iron Man's repulsor, a similar continuous laser, and a laser that explodes about a second after impacting that has a much slower rate of fire than his primary. His intrinsic allows Viz to go intangible, which I know sounds busted, which is why the meter on it runs out really quickly. His support heroic creates holographic decoys that draw enemy aggro. His assault allows him to turn into several swarms of nanites to attack enemies, lifting them into the air and then slamming them back down. Vision's ultimate sees him increase his density by a great deal, slowing his movement speed and completely cutting his ability to fly. In exchange, it wildly increases his knockback and stun. Like any hit from Vision sends enemies flying and will set up most enemies for a takedown in one hit. Overall, Vision excels at being a Superman, but is still working on just being a man, and his kit revolves around him getting it through crowds to focus on single targets and dealing heavy stun to them. As far as the costumes, Vision hasn't changed his look much in the comics, but I'd love to see a take on White Vision, the classic Vision look, and his design from the all-new, all-different era.
Is this a good idea? Probably not. Do I care? No.
Simon Williams is an actor with a very conflicted career. While he has tried to branch out as an artist and do smaller, more intimate dramas, Simon's career-defining role is as a movie hero called the Titanium Man, a character adapted from the pages of timely comics and loosely adapted by the real-life superhero Iron Man. The Titanium Man franchise is wildly successful, but after A-Day, the studio chooses to cease production on those films. After all, why continue to push films based on a character that reminds people of a man who was responsible for so much death and destruction on A-Day? And since Simon's brand is almost synonymous with the Titanium Man franchise, Simon slowly but surely stops getting work, stops making money, and becomes resentful of Tony Stark for really indirectly ruining his life. And then Simon gets an opportunity for revenge. You see, Simon's estranged brother Eric works for a little science company called AIM, and they are putting together a team of remarkable people to take out the Avengers once and for all, ending the threat they pose to society. Simon doesn't care about that necessarily, he just really hates Tony Stark, so Simon volunteers for a procedure. Eric's boss George, better known as MODOK, bombards Simon with ionic energy, granting him phenomenal powers such as flight, increased durability, energy projection, super strength, and plenty more. Then the Avengers arrive, and Simon goes to work, handily defeating Captain America, Iron Man, Black Widow, even Thor and Hulk. And right before he's about to kill Iron Man, Miss Marvel recognizes Simon and starts talking him down. And Simon realizes Kamala's just a kid, the kind of kid he used to make movies for. And that's when he realizes that he was wrong. He was a victim of fate, and the Avengers didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, much less Simon personally. And he rejects AIM. They don't mind much, they have other plans, but Simon apologizes and chooses to join the Avengers to atone for that assault and to live up to the ideals he had portrayed in his movies so long ago. And Kamala suggests a fitting new name for Simon: Wonder Man. Wonder Man's powers are really diverse, and I had a lot of fun coming up with stuff for him. For starters, everything I said about Spectrum's ranged abilities apply to Simon as well, but instead of applying cosmic energy, they apply a new ionic energy status effect. His intrinsic ability converts his intrinsic meter into willpower, which makes Simon very hard to kill since he can regenerate on command. His support surrounds nearby allies with ionic energy, increasing their defense so long as they're within range of him. His assault is an AoE burst of ionic energy that doesn't damage enemies as much, but it does fill up that status bar. Which, to address it really quickly, the ionic status effect means that when enemies die, they explode, with a much bigger radius than the Gamma explosion, but without spreading ionic energy the way that Gamma does. Wonder Man's ultimate unlocks his purple and red ionic form, which increases his range damage and his defense and incorporates more blast effects into his melee combos. Overall, Simon is a guy seeking redemption and an opportunity to prove he is the hero he has always performed as, and his kit revolves around making enemies explosive and protecting his team. For costumes, I'd love to see his iconic red safari jacket, the dorky green and red costume from his first appearance, and the obnoxiously ugly WM costume.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm hearing voices, or maybe I'm just crazy. But then I remember that's the last bit of sanity I have, trying to get me to fall asleep at a reasonable time.
Wanda Maximoff was a teenage immigrant living in San Francisco with her brother Pietro and her parents when A-Day happened. Like a lot of people, Wanda's home collapsed when the Chimera explosion took out part of the city's power grid and caused an earthquake. Wanda's parents were crushed under the rubble, and Wanda and Pietro were forced to live on the streets after their parents were inadvertently killed by the Avengers. But that's not the only way the lives of the Maximoff twins were changed. You see, the trauma from that incident also awakened powers within the siblings. In Wanda's case, she gained what could only be described as magical powers. Unbeknownst to her, she was actually right. Wanda unlocked latent magical genes within her that, among many other things, allow her to fly, manipulate energy, and cast hexes that manipulate the probability of any event that Wanda decides. Wanda and Pietro assumed that these were the powers of the Inhumans that AIM was hunting, but they were never detected. Over the years, Wanda learned to control her powers by studying magic from whatever sources she could find, and alongside her brother, became a vigilante who protected the people in the streets of San Francisco, adopting the moniker of the Scarlet Witch. Eventually, Wanda and Pietro were found by AIM and offered a chance to make a real difference, and legitimately help people. If they wanted to save the world, they had to help kill the Avengers. Wanda joins cautiously, but upon further investigation into AIM's facilities, Wanda realizes something. AIM was never hunting the Inhumans to help them, but experimenting on them and killing them. Wanda could not participate in the kind of persecution that drove her parents out of their home country, so she left AIM and went to the Avengers, reluctantly joining them. Pietro, on the other hand, was held captive, but we'll get to him later. Wanda's kit is hard to design, primarily because her power set is so diverse, but let's start with the ranged. Wanda can switch between 3 identical energy bolts that can apply 3 different status effects, and the players would be able to choose which ones from her skill tree. Her intrinsic ability allows melee attacks to have a completely random status effect applied to them with every hit. Her support heroic allows her to mind control or puppeteer a small number of enemies for a short amount of time, or until they're killed by a teammate or another enemy. Her assault heroic exists in a similar vein, allowing her to summon undead warriors to fight alongside her. These warriors come with incredibly poor health, but spectacularly strong stun damage. Her ultimate allows her to transform part of the arena into a decrepit hellscape, which slows down enemies and damages them over time. Wanda joins the Avengers to protect those who are persecuted, and her kit revolves around playing as the group's druid and applying status effects and stun damage from a distance. For her costume, I would love to see this suit, which was inspired by her Romani heritage, the costume of the Silver Witch, and her suit from Avengers: The Crossing.
Don't joke about murder. I was murdered once, and it offends me.
Pietro Maximoff has the same backstory I just explained for Wanda, but with a few alterations. When their house collapsed and teenage Pietro gained new abilities, he gained an enhanced metabolism, increased physical attributes, and most notably, super speed. And when he and his sister became vigilantes, he took on the name Quicksilver. When Wanda left AIM, Pietro was captured by MODOK and forced to join the supervillain crew MODOK had assembled under the threat of Wanda's death. But the Avengers were able to rescue Pietro, and he begrudgingly joined the Avengers in the interest of protecting his sister. Pietro's speed isn't quite as flashy or versatile as another comic book speedster I'd love to see in a superhero game someday, but let's start here. His range involves Pietro running up to enemies in a dash and punching them in the blink of an eye before returning to his original spot. If you're familiar with the character Yo-Yo from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it's a lot like that. His intrinsic, naturally, allows him to increase his movement and attack speed. His support alters his enemy's speed, making it so that every hit freezes an enemy in place. His assault has him run as fast as possible and then dead stop in front of his enemies, creating a sonic boom. For his ultimate, Pietro runs in a circle fast enough to create a tornado, which sucks enemies in before running through them like a bowling ball. For Pietro, it's all about family, and his kit focuses on dealing damage as fast as possible. For costumes, I'd love to see his first appearance costume with the Peter Pan shoes, his Tron-esque costume from when he was on the Uncanny Avengers, and his suit from Avengers: The Crossing, partly to pair with Wanda's suit that I said you should bring over from that book.
I'm naturally funny because my life is a joke.
Sam Wilson is a soldier in the Resistance in the not-too-distant future. You see, the events of the story up till now have erased the Kree apocalypse future that the present-day Avengers have known, and while they haven't yet saved the future, they've certainly altered it. Now it's not Hawkeye who survives the Kree invasion, but Captain America, so naturally the Resistance is doing a lot better in this timeline. And Cap took on a Ward, a soldier who serves as his right-hand man, Sam Wilson. Sam manages to keep up with the Captain with a kit bash pack that holds 2 metal wings, enabling Sam to fly and earning him the nickname the Falcon. Sam is also an Inhuman who has a telepathic link with birds, specifically with the last surviving Falcon and Sam's partner, Redwing. The future Resistance had a plan to send Steve on a one-way trip back to the past to warn the Avengers on how to stop the Kree invasion. But just before the time jump, Steve was fatally wounded by Kree soldiers. With his dying breath, Steve asks Sam to deliver the message to the past, and gifts Sam his shield. No, not that one. Steve's original shield was destroyed during the invasion, so he's since been using a prototype built by Tony Stark. It's a hard light shield projected by a gauntlet. So, Sam travels back to the past to honor his mentor and save the future. I wanted to include aspects of both Sam's identities as the Falcon and Captain America in his kit, so let's examine how I did that. Sam's ranged attacks reflect this the most. Sam can pull out a pistol that he pairs with frontal defense from the shield. He can also fire off a small number of metal or hard light feathers, depending on the skin, from his wings, which can pin enemies before being recalled like Thor's hammer. Sam can also, naturally, throw the shield, which ricochets completely on its own without any targeting. His intrinsic meter is built by blocking attacks with the shield. Once it's full, double tapping the button allows Sam to overcharge the shield gauntlet, allowing him to throw 3 shields at once that bounce off of enemies independently. His support heroic sees Redwing flying around the battlefield, collecting regenerative, heroic, and intrinsic orbs and delivering them to allies in need. His assault allows Falcon to fire missiles from his wing pack in a mortar-like fashion, and his ultimate sees him hold up the shield and just plow through enemies with the booster pack, kinda like Reinhardt. Ultimately, Sam joins the Avengers to prevent the apocalypse and honor the legacy of Captain America. For his costumes, I really want to see Sam's green and orange first appearance suit, his black and red Alex Ross suit, and of course, the current iteration of his Captain America costume, complete with the new shield, since I really like that design. And naturally, Sam's comic and movie Captain America costumes would have different animations to accommodate the physical shield, only using the hard light shield for that multi-fire ability.
I've never encountered a problem that can't be solved with a spontaneous musical number.
Brian Braddock was a grad student who got in a motorcycle accident that should have killed him. As he lay dying, Brian was approached by the wizard Merlin, yes, he exists, don't question it, and was offered a choice between the Sword of Might and the Amulet of Right. Brian chose the amulet and was magically transformed into Captain Britain, and everything kinda goes nuts from here. Brian draws his power from a dimension known as Otherworld, which is a realm manifested by the combined will of the British people. This allows Brian to fly, vastly increases his strength, reflexes, and durability, and that's about it. It's pretty fucking lame for someone who's drawing power from another dimension. During his exploits as Captain Britain, Brian also found the sword Excalibur, which can cut through and kill anything, and has since employed it as part of his arsenal. Brian joins the Avengers almost against their will. You see, Brian is not the only Captain Britain. He is the Captain Britain of our universe, and a member of the Captain Britain Corps, which guards the entire multiverse. And Brian knows that his universe is particularly unstable due to AIM's experiments with time travel, but that also poses part of the problem with the coming Kree invasion. If the Kree take our Earth, they now have the means to take every Earth across the multiverse. So Brian's boss, Saturnine, has tasked Brian with ensuring that this universe does not fall by any means necessary. So Brian believes that the best way to ensure he can fulfill his mission is to join the Avengers and work collaboratively with Earth's mightiest heroes to ensure that they can save all of the multiverse. And since Captain Britain joined the Avengers, his powers have increased tenfold, mostly because the people of Britain believe in him more with the Avengers at his side. Brian's kit was really fucking hard to design because his powers are really hard to fit into this model. Like, you're strong, durable, and you can fly. Congrats, Brian, you've all the powers of a brick thrown through a window. Hence why I added Excalibur to his arsenal. So let's start there. Brian can throw and recall Excalibur akin to Thor's hammer. Simple enough. For his intrinsic, I wanted to increase Brian's speed and defense. His support would see him taunt nearby enemies to draw aggro while also vastly increasing his defense. His assault would see him charge enemies with Excalibur held up like he were jousting. This allows Brian to impale his enemies, and whenever he hits a wall, he lodges the sword in it and leaves his enemies kebabbed, until of course he recalls it. Brian's ultimate is a lunge that has him land sword first, impaling whatever enemy he lands directly on and having an absolutely massive AoE. Overall, Brian is a hero who responds to a higher calling, and his kit revolves around beasting through enemies and single target combat with the sword. For costumes, I'd like to see all of Brian's superhero identities represented, with his first appearance Captain Britain suit, his alternate universe Captain Marshall suit, and his most recent Captain Avalon suit.
Oh, I regret getting dragged into your heterosexual tomfoolery.
Carol Danvers is the hero this franchise deserves. Carol was a test pilot for the US Air Force who worked her way up to the rank of head of security for NASA. She worked closely with a scientist by the name of Walter Lawson until Kree warriors attacked Carol and Lawson. It was then revealed that Lawson was a Kree in disguise by the name of Mar-Vell, who has worked to protect the planet from his people's invasion. The Kree experimented on Carol and Mar-Vell, specifically exposing Carol to a device called the Psych-Magnetron, which transferred some of Mar-Vell's power to Carol. When the two broke out of the facility, Carol made a decision. She would use her new powers to become a hero and defender of Earth known as Miss Marvel, a nod to her friend and now mentor. Eventually, Mar-Vell would be killed in the same incident that gave Monica Rambeau her powers, and Carol would take on his title of Captain. As Captain Marvel, Carol joined the Avengers but knew there was more that she could be doing. So while Carol retained her membership, she went out into space to extend the goodwill of planet Earth and help resolve conflicts beyond the Avengers' reach. She stayed there for 6 years because she became embroiled in war after war and was not able to establish contact with the Avengers for some time. And then Carol got word that the Kree are returning to Earth to conquer or destroy it, and now Carol has returned, ready to fight the Kree Armada and save her planet. Carol's ranged attacks naturally mirror that of Spectrum. a single shot, a wave of energy, and a continuous beam, all powered by her intrinsic, which can also apply cosmic energy to all of her melee strikes. For her support, I wanted to pull from two sources of inspiration. One of Carol's lesser known but very fun powers, and Virgil from Devil May Cry. Carol can create an energy duplicate that not only draws enemy aggro, but also directly copies what you do as Carol as you do it. Alternatively, pressing the button again can alternate in a 1-second delay. For Carol's assault, I wanted to keep it simple. Big energy blast, nothing fancy. And Carol's ultimate is her cutting loose and transforming into binary. Carol's binary form projects an aura of cosmic damage and makes her completely invincible, which is why this form is only accessible for an incredibly short time. Binary also has new ranged attacks in the form of firing miniature white holes, which explode on impact with the force of nothing else in the game. Overall, Carol is a hero defined by her inability to quit and a strong desire to save everyone, and her kit, I hope, reflects her status as one of the most powerful Avengers who prioritizes large targets. For her costumes, I'd love to see her first appearance suit, complete with the midriff, her iconic black and red Miss Marvel suit, and her outfit from her time as Warbird.
Why did you kill him? He could have had hopes and dreams. He could have had a family.
Thor, it was just an ant.
And that's everybody. 12 characters that I think Marvel's Avengers Reassembled needs in its roster. There are an additional 8 characters in that Patreon exclusive video, so feel free to check that out, but unfortunately for my fingers typing this and my throat reading it, we are not done yet. See, the thing about a roster like this is it needs a game surrounding it, and I want to talk about the actual game now, starting with the story. I have 4 arcs in mind. One playable as the game's main campaign upon launch, and the rest released over the course of 3 years in operations. And again, 2 more arcs in that Patreon video. I don't exactly have all these written beat by beat, these are more just the broad strokes of each story. And this section is also written with the assumption that you have a general idea of what happens in the story of Marvel's Avengers, specifically in the Reassemble campaign, the Taking Aim at Future Imperfect operations, the War for Wakanda expansion, and the Scientist Supreme Villain sector. So, here's how I would continue the story of Marvel's Avengers.
And what do I get out of this?
I will give you $1.
What do you think I am? A chump? I would never do it for $1.
Oh, how about $2?
You got yourself a deal.
We'd open in a similar fashion to the first game's 8A prologue, but in the future wasteland. We'd play as a Resistance member named Michael, a cyborg who goes through a relatively normal day in the apocalypse before arriving at his big assignment. Michael is being sent back in time to before A-Day to stop the events that would lead to this timeline. But unfortunately, the Maestro shows up and breaks the time machine right as Michael is being sent through. Michael gets bombarded with energy, turning him into a being of pure energy, before landing in the past. Unfortunately, he's a few years too late and is captured and put in stasis by AIM. Flash forward a few years and we're in the present day, and we do a mission with the Avengers. Specifically, the 6 members that you get to play as on launch from the first game. Much like the 8A prologue, you switch from team member to team member, highlighting their unique abilities and playstyles as they all bust through an AIM facility. And when they get to the prison cell they're looking for, who do they find but Michael? They free him and escape, taking him back to the Chimera. Then we can get some opening credits to explain what we missed between the last game and now. Since the end of the last game's narrative, the Avengers have made a lot of progress in getting back on their feet and taking down AIM. While public opinion on the team still isn't what it used to be, they've found a nice middle ground. Some people trust them again, while others hate them and continue to vouch for AIM. The Inhumans have found peace by colonizing an island in the middle of the ocean known as Atalan, and living there to avoid persecution, although some Inhumans continue to live in society. Jen Walters has done a lot to tear down AIM from a legal standpoint, and the Avengers have gotten AIM to a point where now they're the ones fighting on the back foot. They've even been able to begin rebuilding their headquarters in San Francisco. This chain of victories is partly by recruiting 3 new members, She-Hulk, War Machine, and Spectrum. That hasn't deterred AIM from continuing their work, however. Still driven to save the world and prevent the apocalypse, MODOK and Monica Rappaccini have continued to experiment, time travel, and everything in between to rid the world of Inhumans and stop the oncoming Kree Invasion. So now that everything's all caught up, we check back in with Michael. The Avengers are keeping Michael on the Chimera until he wakes up, and when he does, they explain that his body has been severely altered, giving him incredible powers, including matter alteration, energy projection, teleportation, and manipulation of time and space. They ask him some questions and he gives some answers. His name is Michael Korvac and he's from the future, sent here to prevent the Kree apocalypse. But his quest was foiled and he landed a few years too late to prevent it. The Avengers assume that means he was trying to stop the Chimera's explosion on A-Day, but they misunderstand. Michael isn't here to stop A-Day. He was here to stop the formation of the Avengers. But if he can't prevent their formation, he can always just kill them now. Michael goes off like a nuke, and you play a mission where the Avengers have to work together to save the Chimera crew and make sure it crashes into the ocean rather than a city. They succeed and watch the Chimera just straight up disintegrate in the ocean, leaving behind nothing but a floating Michael Korvac. The Avengers resettle in their compound, and from this point on, I don't really have a plot breakdown or outline, but the story mostly revolves around the Avengers fighting a war on two fronts. MODOK is trying to capture Korvac to use him to destroy the Kree, while Korvac is just trying to cause havoc to get the Avengers' attention so he can kill them all. This will culminate with Michael being killed by MODOK, who absorbs all of Michael's powers after the Avengers are tricked into defeating him. Honestly, I kind of came up with this after I came up with the other three, so if this feels less defined than these other arcs that I'm about to explain, that's probably why.
Kamala.
Ooh, I can tell by the tone of your voice that you're disappointed. Unfortunately, I must further disappoint you by affirming how little I give a fuck.
These other three arcs are built around my desire to wrap up loose ends from the last game, starting with Roy. The last game gave us a scene of Roy, the robot intelligence created by Hank Pym, staring at the Cosmic Cube, and I think that's worth exploring. So this first narrative expansion sees Hank notice something distressing regarding Roy. He's becoming erratic, even aggressive, and eventually hostile towards the Avengers, and is no longer responding to the name Roy, preferring now to go by Ultron, who takes the Cosmic Cube and all the other Roy units and leaves. The Avengers come to Pym's aid, and Hank assesses that in the confusion, someone took the Ant-Man suit. This is where we get a few missions related to Scott's story, which I already detailed, and after that we get a glimpse of Ultron's plan. Open up a path to the microverse and banish the Kree there. The problem is, he can't do it without enough Pym particles, and he knows he's not going to be able to get them from Hank with the Avengers on watch. So it becomes a race between Ultron and the Avengers to find an AIM facility containing a source of almost limitless Pym particles. This source turns out to be Nadia Van Dyne, who Ultron partly drains of her powers. Nadia becomes the Wasp, and now the Avengers are trying to stop the next step in Ultron's plan, creating a person body capable of fighting the Kree and the Avengers. The Avengers think they can use this body to further their goals, but they know that if Ultron controls it, he'll be unstoppable. So they try to stop him from creating it, you do a fun boss battle against the Vision, and then the Avengers can introduce a new AI created by Hank and Tony, making the Vision a true agent of peace. Ultron decides that his plan isn't going to work, so he just decides to kill the Avengers. You chase Ultron in the microverse and destroy his new body, which is made of adamantium, but it's implied that Ultron's consciousness remains somewhere, so you can keep Ultron around for other missions and boss battles.
So I got this amazing plan.
We fail almost every time you say that.
Well, this is the same, but with a hamster involved.
The second arc is meant to fulfill a need I've had for years, an itch that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is likely to never scratch. The Masters of Evil. And since most of you are probably unfamiliar with the concept, unless you're like cool and you watch Avengers vs. Mightiest Heroes, I should probably explain them. The Masters of Evil are, plain and simple, a team of the Avengers' greatest villains who join forces to destroy or otherwise fuck with the Avengers. The team has had many incarnations over the years, and just like I did with Ultron and the Heroes, I'm going to take some liberties and remix lore a little bit, while also introducing some of my own ideas. This arc is also going to serve the purpose of removing AIM from the story in a big way. You'll see what I mean. So we'd start with MODOK. He and Monica are formulating a plan to kill the Avengers, and someone new approaches them. We don't see her face, but we'll eventually learn that this is a Thor villain known as the Enchantress and her bodyguard, Scourge. And Enchantress makes a proposition. MODOK needs to outsource. Guys with guns are not going to solve this problem. What he needs is a proper answer to the Avengers. So MODOK and Enchantress begin recruiting. MODOK promotes a high-level AIM agent named Eric Williams, fits him with a prosthetic hand built like a scythe, and gives him the codename the Grim Reaper. Eric also has a brother, Simon, who MODOK bombards with ionic radiation stolen from Korvac and turns him into Wonder Man. AIM also finds a way to reconstitute Claw's sonic form, just less kaiju-sized, and eventually find Wanda and Pietro Maximoff that give them uniforms matching their personas and the needs of their abilities. AIM already has Taskmaster and Abomination on the payroll, so it makes sense to include them here. And last but not least, AIM recruits Titania and Whiplash. So that's our starting lineup. Scourge the Executioner, the Grim Reaper, Claw, Abomination, Taskmaster, Titania, Whiplash, Wonder Man, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, led by MODOK, Monica Rappaccini, and Enchantress from afar. The first operation would lead with you playing as Wonder Man through his origin and eventual change of heart, which means you'd actually fight the Avengers as a solo opening boss. Partly for the gimmick of it, partly to demonstrate that the Masters of Evil pose an actual threat to the Avengers. Simon switches sides, and the rest of the first operation is the Avengers targeting specific AIM bases that Simon has exposed, and each one is guarded by a different member of the Masters of Evil, so you get a boss fight at the end of each base. The last one is against Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver at the same time, which will end when someone explains to Wanda and Pietro that they're guarding a facility for inhuman testing and experimentation. Wanda immediately drops the fight and offers to help the Avengers, but before Pietro can do the same, MODOK teleports in and kidnaps him. And that transitions us into the second operation. Wanda has joined the Avengers, and now things get a little bit more interesting. The premise for this one is that it is a string of missions that all take place concurrently. The Avengers split up and attack multiple bases at once that Pietro could be held captive in, meaning you start the operation by picking different teams of Avengers with the roster you have without being able to duplicate any of them. Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, and Ant-Man go to one place, Captain America, Scarlet Witch, Spider-Man, and Vision go to another, etc. Each of these bases is guarded by the Masters of Evil that you haven't fought yet, and whichever one you send Wanda to is the one you play last, and where you actually find Quicksilver. The final operation, now that you have Pietro on the team, is the whole Masters of Evil experience. The Avengers strike a few more AIM bases, and MODOK starts to get desperate after losing a few critical locations. So, he sends the Avengers a message about where to find him, and this is where we get the Boss Gauntlet. A hive where every floor is a boss battle against a different Master of Evil in a different order, ending with a boss fight against MODOK and Monica. They'll both escape, sure, but AIM is now functionally dead. We're gonna treat them more or less the same way that the MCU treated Hydra after the Winter Soldier. A few rats didn't go down with the ship, some facilities are intact, some leaders are still out there, yada yada. And naturally, AIM cloned the shit out of most of the Masters of Evil, so we can actually keep them around for daily boss fights.
Don't go picking a fight with me. I could make your life very difficult.
Wow, I wonder what it would be like to have a difficult life.
I like opening these arcs with perspective switches. Why stop now? The Kree Invasion opens in the future. As I said before, this is not the future imperfect timeline where Maestro, Old Man Hawkeye, and Korvac come from. This is a new timeline, where the Kree occupy Earth rather than destroy it, and most of the Avengers are dead except for Steve and Hank. They've built a time gate to send back a single soldier who was born after the Kree Invasion, Sam Wilson. Sam goes back in time, as I detailed earlier, and he arrives right as the Kree Invasion is beginning. The Avengers do what they can to play offensively, striking Kree ships in orbit, but for every one they destroy, 5 more show up. It's at the end of this first operation that we learn why the Kree are here, or at least part of it. Thousands of years ago, the Kree came to Earth and did some experiments on the, at the time, very young human race. The experiments were tests to see if the Kree could increase their own power, and they used humans as lab rats. But the tests were inconclusive, so the planet was abandoned and forgotten. But those experiments passed on those modified genes, which became activated by the Terrigen Mists, creating the Inhumans, which the Kree are only aware of, due to MODOK activating the Kree Sentry at the end of the first game. But it's more than that. Through the introduction of Captain Britain, we also learn that the Kree plans to enslave the Inhumans and use them as an army to conquer the entire multiverse. I know I'm pretty heavily changing the Kree's motivation here, but I wanted to find ways to fit the Kree into the world of Marvel's Avengers more, without continuing to introduce new concepts like the Skrulls. So Carol shows up with more information from an old friend of hers, a Kree contact informs her of the coming invasion, and the Kree officially launch an attack on Atalan. The Avengers defend against the siege with the help of the Inhumans, and a final battle begins with the Supreme Intelligence. Yes, I know the Supreme Intelligence is usually like a big head in the jar, like Zordon, but I think it'd be cool if that head can shoot lasers and stuff, or he uses person bodies like Ultron does to fight the Avengers. The real draw of this is that the Avengers will cycle in and out of the fight at random, so every player's final battle with the Supreme Intelligence is completely different, almost randomly generated. The character you play switches with every phase of the fight until the final blow is dealt by all of the Avengers, in a quick-time event reminiscent of God of War Ragnarok's final bout against Odin, and also kind of one of the long takes of the Avengers movies that show off everyone's powers. With the Supreme Intelligence defeated, Carol's Kree contact takes over command of the Kree Armada. I think this can be Phyla-Vell, who Carol looked after when Mar-Vell was killed. The Kree leave, the day is saved, and the Avengers are finally back together. Not a resistance fighting off the back foot, but truly Earth's mightiest heroes.
When you've been on the internet as long as I have, you develop thick skin.
Navy blue isn't your color.
Navy blue brings out my eyes, you prick.
Now don't click off yet because we are still not done. Because the narrative and characters are only part of an experience, we need to take a critical look at the core gameplay of Marvel's Avengers and see how a sequel can improve upon the foundations. Now, I've always argued that apart from a few game feel issues, Avengers' gameplay isn't bad. It is a perfectly fine looter/beat-em-up, but it should be so much more than that. While the moment-to-moment gameplay is fine, the foundation is utterly broken. Every Avenger shouldn't be able to do the same thing. Iron Man should not be digging for gear in chests. Microtransactions shouldn't be the only ways to get good cosmetics. So I want to do away with all the loot. No more of that. Just, it's fucking gone. Your power level increases when your level does, and there's a fucking astronomically high level cap. Done deal. The skill trees, I think we can keep. I know a lot of people hate the skill trees, and while I do think it's pretty tedious to get through all of them, it was also kind of fun to tweak certain abilities to my liking. We can revamp the skill trees to include the status effects as well, since we're doing away with the loot, but keeping status effects. I think it makes sense if only certain characters can access certain status effects. Like, I don't think it would make sense for Black Panther to have gamma powers, or for Captain America to be able to access ice powers. And you don't need to max out your character to get all of the abilities. We'll make the skill trees finish about a quarter of the way through the level progression, and from then on it's mostly just getting stronger. And now I want to hone in on a few ideas I have that I think could work to make the game feel more complete.
Do dragons fart fire?
I don't know.
I thought you went to college.
Between the loot grind and massive skill tree, Avengers was already kind of an RPG, so why stop there? With my buddy Martha, who helped write this video and is a big fan of Dungeons & Dragons and is smiling at me like a fucking loser because I'm recording this while I'm doing a Discord call with her, we were able to cook up a class system for Marvel's Avengers and fit both the pre-existing characters and the new one into that mold. As I said earlier, I don't love the idea that any Avenger can handle any problem, but I also think that can make the game a little needlessly complicated if that's not the case. So we designed it with the mentality of a game like World War Z. The classes don't mean you can only do a certain thing, just that you're amazing at doing that thing. We also centered the classes around these 4 questions. How do you affect your allies? How do you affect your enemies? How good is your health? And how do you play the mission objective? And we named each class after a different Avengers run or team, starting with the Mighty Avengers. This is your typical warrior or DPS class, focused on damaging enemies above all else, and doing extra damage against standard-size enemies like synthoids. Mighty Avengers have moderate health and play the objective by staying off of it, really, focusing on bottlenecking enemy spawns before they can get to the objectives. Characters in this class include Captain America, Black Panther, Kate Bishop, She-Hulk, the Wasp, and Quicksilver. Secret Avengers serve as a sort of assassin class, applying stealth effects to allies and using their stealth abilities for takedowns, as well as having more ranged abilities and dealing more stun to enemies. Their low health means they'll be focused on striking enemies on point from afar, and focusing on hitting ranged enemies trying to do the same thing to your team. Characters in this class include Black Widow, Winter Soldier, Spectrum, Ant-Man, Scarlet Witch, and War Machine. The Uncanny Avengers would serve as this game's support class and control class, boosting allies' health and intrinsic meters and increasing their defense, while using their heroic attacks to clear out clusters of enemies. They share the rank of moderate health with the Mighty Avengers, and play objectives by clearing out and holding objectives, as well as making it easier for teammates to do the same thing by keeping them alive and charged up. They can also capture objectives and complete tasks faster than anyone else, kind of like the BB units in Battlefront 2. These guys include Iron Man, Hawkeye, Spider-Man, Miss Marvel, Wonder Man, and the Falcon. And lastly, the Ultimate Avengers, the tanks that draw enemy aggro away from teammates while focusing on singular mini-boss targets like Adaptoids and Dreadbots. Their high health means they best play the game by just dispersing smaller crowds and focusing on those bigger targets. And rounding out the roster, the Ultimate Avengers include Hulk, the Thors, Vision, Captain Marvel, and Captain Britain. I think those 4 classes would add a lot of depth to the game without limiting team design. As I said, you can make a team out of any of these guys. Think about it like how Overwatch works without role queue. Sure, a team that's all DPS is going to have a bit of a difficult time, but experienced players who know how to work together will make it work. I also want to reincorporate something from the first game that I absolutely loved. In the first game, there were 2 major artifacts that allow you to temporarily summon Hank Pym or Okoye, who would assist the Avengers by dealing particle or vibranium status damage respectively. That's something I want to expand on with a separate class, Reserve Avengers. These would be non-playable assist characters chosen by your party's popular vote at the start of a mission, and they could be summoned by any member of your team. This allows us to use characters that would otherwise just not fit into the story, and they don't really need lengthy explanations or in-depth game mechanics. At launch, you'd have access to Hank Pym and Okoye functioning exactly as they used to, but we would also add an A-bomb for gamma damage. And each story arc would introduce a new character. The Ultron arc would introduce Janet with the growth status effect, the Masters of Evil would introduce Quake using a sonic effect, and the Kree would introduce Betsy Braddock doing cosmic damage. And if you really wanted to, have a PlayStation exclusive Spider-Man assist where he uses his Venom Strike to deal shock damage. I do have a different idea from where you could use Brooklyn Spidey though, but this could also work. And really there's no limit for how many of these you could introduce. As many characters as you want. You could do Spider-Woman, Shuri, Firestar. Hell, you could even do Namor if you wanted.
Hey, this was almost a great idea.
You just described 90% of your ideas.
Hey, I think you said this when you last dated Daredevil.
But of course, these classes and characters need missions to complete. The missions and boss design of the first game is easily one of the weakest elements. I complained about it at length in the original video, but to summarize, the missions all boil down to just standing in a spot or punching a thing, and the bosses can almost all be taken out by just brute force punching and shooting. I think the game can retain bosses and missions like that, but there needs to be some variety. I think introducing some puzzle solving into the game would be cool, since War for Wakanda had some incredibly simple puzzles. I also think having missions where all 4 characters had to do something at once would be easy enough fix, as well as having missions where the characters split up to solve objectives. Both of those would require a massive upgrade to the AI of the companion characters, but it's doable. That's my main issue with the first game's raids. If you don't have 4 friends who all have this game, they're fucking unplayable. And as for bosses, I'll take literally anything other than Worship and Warbot. Some actual comic characters with a little bit more mechanical depth, please. And that actually brings me to another idea that I had. I really like the idea of the iconic mission chain, and I wanted to keep that. But this time they culminate in solo missions like those from Ultimate Alliance. Each iconic chain ends in a mission designed for a specific character's traversal and skill set where you battle a villain from the comics associated with that hero in some way, or who would be an interesting match for them. And real quick lightning round to pitch you those hero-villain pairings. Ant-Man vs. Yellowjacket, Black Panther vs. Killmonger, Black Widow vs. Yelena Belova, Captain America vs. US Agent, Captain Britain vs. Slaymaster, Captain Marvel vs. Yon-Rogg, Falcon vs. Flag Smasher, Hawkeye vs. Swordsman, Hulk vs. Absorbing Man, Iron Man vs. Ghost, Kate Bishop vs. Madame Mask, Miss Marvel vs. Kamran, Quicksilver vs. Speed Demon, Scarlet Witch vs. Agatha Harkness, She-Hulk vs. Bi-Beast, Spectrum vs. Blackout, Spider-Man vs. Scorpion, the Mighty Thor vs. her universe's version of Odin, the Wasp vs. Whirlwind, Thor vs. Curse, Vision vs. Ultimo, War Machine vs. Blizzard, Winter Soldier vs. Batroc the Leaper, and Wonder Man vs. Count Nefaria. You can see me trying to pull from a deeper well than the movies with these guys, and some of them reference other material and wrap up plot threads from the first game, but yeah, each villain would also be in the daily villain sector rotation, so you can fight each of them as the full Avengers. Obviously, characters like Batroc would have more goons than guys like Odin, and it will all scale accordingly, and completing each iconic mission chain would net you that hero's classic costume. Speaking of which...
Strawberry milk does not taste of strawberries, nor of milk.
Go the fuck to sleep, Thor.
Microtransactions for AAA games bad, recolors bad, best costumes locked behind a paywall bad. Now that that's out of the way, how would this game supply you with cosmetics? Easily. Certain levels would have certain areas that can only be accessed by characters with certain abilities. Those areas would contain a chest with fragments of different rarities to be collected and eventually fused into a random costume or emote of that rarity. Every level up would give you a new cosmetic, mostly nameplates, but milestone levels would supply emotes, costumes, or both. Each new character begins with a starter costume and gets their iconic costume at the end of an operation, while returning heroes already have their iconic suits. And as mentioned earlier, the iconic mission chains would get you the hero's classic costume at the end. And there would be exotic missions like raids, which would supply you with exotic fragments at the end. Unlike every other rarity, you can actually pick which exotic costume you want. Is that simple enough? Actually, yeah, a little too simple, so let me add another layer. I think certain cosmetics should affect gameplay in some minor ways, mostly audio and animations. If you pick an MCU Iron Man skin, his repulsors should look and sound like his MCU repulsors. If you pick the World War II skin for Cap, maybe he has that original shield. Hell, change up the animations completely if Thor is using Stormbreaker for one of his MCU costumes, and you can even double that with a Yarnbjorn attached to his Unworthy skin. And, maybe Injustice 2 broke my brain a bit too much, but I think Premier skins are a really cool concept. In case you don't know, Injustice 2's characters had fully customizable gear kits, but some of them also had something called Premier skins. These were non-customizable skins for certain characters that changed their appearance, voice, and dialogue to completely different characters. Flash could become Reverse Flash. You could sub out Captain Cold with Mr. Freeze, and even switch out Raiden for Black Lightning. Mortal Kombat 11 had something similar, with the movie actors for Sonya, Johnny, and Raiden coming in to play those parts again. So why not do something similar here? If you pick a Joe Fixit skin for Hulk, he should have unique voice lines and be able to talk in cutscenes. You could just as easily do Beta Ray Bill for Thor, have Miles come in as Spider-Man, or replace the Winter Soldier with the Punisher. Hell, maybe even make some of the villains playable. Replace Hulk with Abomination, have Yelena take over as Black Widow, or switch out Captain America for US Agent. Obviously, these Premier skins wouldn't have an effect during major story cutscenes, but maybe during side missions and optional dialogue, it could be fun to hear these actors take over.
What's your greatest weakness?
Interpreting the semantics of a question, but ignoring the pragmatics.
Could you give an example?
Yes, I could.
And finally, I'm done. This took me like 2 months to write and 3 more to put together, so I'm glad this is over. But look at what we have now. A completely fictitious sequel to an underwhelming game that never got to live up to its potential. One that adds a bunch of new characters, completes story threads set up in the first game, and proposes fixes for some of the core gameplay elements that were severely lacking. But that's not all, folks. Because I know at least one of you fuckers is gonna say, but what about the Loki subplot that they set up and never completed? Well, fear not. With the help of my editor Martha, I have launched a companion video for this, available to my $5 plus patrons. While this video covers the launch and first 3 years of Marvel's Avengers Reassembled, the Patreon video will contain some of my ideas that would have overbloated this video more than it already is. The main story of this universe ends with Year 3's Kree Invasion arc, and the next 2 years are kind of the future of these Avengers, dealing more with mystical threats and with street-level ones, and introducing 8 new characters who I will not give away just yet, but yes, it does include Doctor Strange. So if you want any more of this pitch, head on over to the Patreon. I really want this game to exist, in any capacity. More of these versions of these characters, another superhero game that lets you play with your friends, really anything. God, I guess what I'm saying is, I want the Avengers to reassemble.
A-team like Avenger. A-team like Avenger. A-team. With the A-team like Avenger. Pop this every day like Avenger. I'ma go and do my thing like Avenger. I'ma ride it for my team like Avenger. Against evil, we gon' fight. We gon' bring the justice, we gon' do it all night. Together through it up, I'm making sure the city right. We better than the league, bitch, I'm better with my team. I feel fly like Iron Man. I'm the man, feel like Spider-Man. Catch me swinging through the city on a Friday. If there's a problem, I'ma solve it, feel like Friday. They put that trust in me, luckily. Captain of the team, I can never lead them down. I keep a black
Avengers, Reassembled.
And a special thanks to Omar, Christian, and Devrick for donating to the $10 tier on Patreon.
If you would like to support Chimera Films, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, as well as donating to the Patreon using the link below.
Now, if you'll excuse me, Spider-Man asked me to go fight editorial. Something to do with someone named Paul?